The ice storm on Talvex, 7 howled like a living thing, battering Captain Jake Morrison's survey ship with winds that could strip paint from metal. Jake gripped the controls as another gust slammed into the hull, making the entire vessel shudder. He had been on hundreds of survey missions across dozens of planets, but something about this frozen moon felt different. Wrong. His sensors pinged. Once. Twice. Then a steady beep that made his heart jump. Biosignatures. 2 of them. Fading fast. Jake zoomed in on the readings. The abandoned research facility, about half a mile from his position. Whatever was down there was alive but barely. The life signs were dropping by the second, like watching a candle flicker out in slow motion. "Command, this is Morrison," he said, already moving toward the equipment locker. "I'm detecting biosigns in the abandoned research facility. 2 signatures, both critical." The response came back immediately, crackling through the static. "Negative, Morrison. Weather's too dangerous. Return to orbit and wait out the storm." "That's an order." Jake stared at his screen. The biosignatures were so weak now. Minutes, he thought. Maybe less. He pulled out his thermal suit, the heavy-duty one designed for extreme cold operations. "Command, you're breaking up," Jake said, reaching for the comm switch. "I can't hear you properly. Bad interference from the storm. Morrison, do not." He cut the connection and sealed his helmet. Sometimes forgiveness was easier to get than permission. The airlock opened and the cold hit him like a physical blow. Even through the insulated suit, Jake felt the temperature drop. The wind screamed past, carrying ice crystals that rattled against his helmet like tiny bullets. Visibility was almost zero. He activated his suit's navigation system and started walking, each step a fight against the wind trying to knock him over. The research station loomed out of the white chaos like a ghost. Its walls were covered in thick ice, and several windows had shattered from the pressure. The main door hung open, swinging in the wind with a metallic screech that cut through the storm's roar. Jake pushed inside and immediately felt the difference. The wind was blocked, but the cold remained. His breath formed clouds inside his helmet. The station's power was dead, leaving everything in dim emergency lighting that cast strange shadows across the frozen corridors. He followed his scanner deeper into the building, past overturned chairs and scattered equipment. Papers frozen mid-flutter covered the floor. Computer screens dark and dead. Whatever had happened here, the evacuation had been rushed. The biosignatures led him to what looked like a specimen holding area. Large cages lined the walls, all empty and open, except for the last one in the corner. Jake's headlamp swept across the space and he froze. 2 small creatures lay curled together on the frozen floor, so still he thought he was too late. Then he saw it, the slight rise and fall of their chests. Barely breathing. Barely alive. They looked like something out of ancient Earth mythology. Dragons. Baby dragons, no bigger than house cats, with scales that might have been bright emerald green under better circumstances. Right now they were covered in frost, their scales dulled and crusted with ice. Their wings were folded tight against their small bodies, and they were pressed together as if trying to share what little warmth they had left. Jake's hands shook as he accessed the station's computer terminal nearby. The logs loaded slowly, fighting against the frozen system. He scrolled through the final entries. Evacuation orders. Storm approaching. Personnel manifest. Equipment secured. And then the last entry, timestamped 12 hours ago. Final status report. All essential personnel evacuated. Essential equipment retrieved. Specimens in Hold C deemed non-essential. Retrieval not cost-effective given storm timeline and specimen value. Recommend disposal upon return or abandonment if facility becomes compromised. Jake read it twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. They had left them here. These researchers had looked at 2 living creatures and decided they weren't worth the effort to save. Cost-effective, Jake muttered, his voice tight with anger. He moved quickly to the cage, forcing the frozen lock open with his gloved hands. "You've got to be kidding me." He scooped up both hatchlings as carefully as he could, cradling them against his chest. They were so cold, like holding 2 pieces of ice carved into dragon shapes. One of them made a tiny sound, barely more than a whisper, and Jake's heart clenched. "I've got you," he said softly, even though they probably couldn't hear him. "You're safe now. I promise." He opened his thermal jacket and tucked both creatures inside, zipping it back up to trap his body heat around them. They felt like frozen stones against his skin, but he could feel their hearts beating. Faint. Weak. But beating. Jake turned and ran, fighting his way back through the frozen corridors, out into the screaming storm, across the ice field toward his ship. Every step felt like it took forever. His lungs burned from the cold air. His legs ached from pushing through the wind. But he didn't stop. He could feel those tiny heartbeats against his chest and he ran faster. Back aboard the Ranger, Jake burst through the airlock, his thermal jacket still sealed tight around the two frozen hatchlings. His ship's heating system kicked in immediately, but he could barely feel it. All he could think about was getting these creatures warm. Captain Morrison, his ship's AI Vera, announced in her calm matter-of-fact voice. I am detecting 2 unregistered life forms. Harboring unregistered xenofauna carries a penalty of. Not now, Vera. Jake snapped, rushing toward the medical bay. He didn't have time for regulations. These little ones were dying. He laid them carefully on the medical table and started grabbing every heated blanket he owned from the storage compartments. The dragons, he'd already started calling them Spark and Jade in his head, looked even worse under the bright lights. Their scales were dull and gray with frost, their breathing so shallow he had to put his hand near their nostrils to feel any air movement at all. They were so cold. Too cold. Jake's hands moved on autopilot, years of emergency training taking over. He wrapped both dragons in the heated blankets, setting them to gradually increase temperature. Too fast would shock their systems. Too slow and they might not make it. He had to get this exactly right. The medical bay wasn't designed for this. It was built for treating humans, maybe the occasional similar species. But dragons? Jake improvised, pulling equipment from different stations and rigging them together. He redirected the environmental controls to pump warm, humid air directly into the medical bay. He mixed nutrient solutions based on what little data Vera could find about reptilian metabolism, adjusting for their size and condition. The first night was the worst. Every alarm made his heart jump. Every irregular reading sent him scrambling to adjust something. Their temperatures were rising but painfully slowly. He sat beside them, monitoring every breath, every heartbeat on the scanners. Come on, he whispered to them. You didn't survive that storm just to give up now. The second day, Jade's breathing improved slightly. Jake allowed himself a moment of hope before exhaustion crashed over him. He'd been awake for over 30 hours. But he couldn't sleep. What if something changed? What if they needed him? He made himself coffee, his 4th cup in as many hours, and went back to his vigil. By the 3rd day, Jake was running on pure determination and caffeine. His eyes felt like sandpaper and he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a proper meal. But the dragons were showing real improvement. Their scales were starting to regain some color, that beautiful emerald green peeking through. Their breathing was steadier, stronger. Jake was checking their hydration levels when it happened. Movement. Small but definite. One of the dragons, the slightly smaller one he'd been calling Spark, shifted under her blanket. Then she opened her eyes. They were golden. Bright, clear, and incredibly intelligent. Not the blank stare of an animal but something more. Something aware. Those eyes focused directly on Jake's face, studying him with an intensity that made him catch his breath. Hey there, Jake whispered, hardly daring to move. You're safe now. I promise you're safe. Spark made a tiny sound, almost like a chirp. Her sister stirred beside her, still sleeping but responding to the noise. Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. He finally allowed himself to sleep that night, curled up in a chair beside the medical bay, one hand resting near the dragons where he could feel their breathing. The transmission that woke him on the 4th day shattered his relief. This is the Quellan Science Directorate, a cold voice announced through the ship's speakers. We have detected unauthorized removal of Directorate property from Research Station Talvex 7. Captain Morrison, you are hereby ordered to return our research specimens immediately. Jake sat up, his mind still foggy with exhaustion. Research specimens. That's what they called them. Not living creatures. Not beings who felt cold and fear and pain. Just property. The specimens in question are genetically modified organisms created under Quellan jurisdiction, the voice continued. They are not natural creatures and possess no legal rights or protections under interstellar law. Failure to comply will result in charges of theft and smuggling. Jake pulled up the Quellan transmission on his main screen. Official. Stamped with all the right seals and codes. Behind him, he heard Spark chirp softly, a questioning sound. Jade was awake too now, both of them watching him with those intelligent golden eyes. He accessed the station's database he downloaded during the rescue. The genetics report was buried deep in the files, probably where the Quellans hoped no one would look. Jake read through it carefully, his anger growing with every line. These weren't lab creations. The genetic markers were completely natural, unchanged, wild. These dragons were the last survivors of a species that had once lived on Talvek's seventh sister moon. A species the Quellans had hunted for decades because their scales were valuable in certain medical applications. They'd hunted them until only two remained. Two babies kept in a research station, probably to be studied before being discarded. The Quellans hadn't created these dragons. They'd nearly destroyed them. Jake looked at Spark and Jade, now watching him with trust in their eyes. They'd chosen to trust him, the first person who'd shown them kindness. And these people wanted them back so they could finish what they'd started. He pulled up the Quellan message again, his finger hovering over the reply button. Then he moved to the delete button instead. The message vanished. Vera, Jake said calmly, set course for the nearest human outpost. Best speed. Captain, the Quellans require. I don't care what they require. Jake stroked Spark's head gently. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing contentedly. These aren't specimens. They're survivors. And I'm not giving them back. 3 weeks had passed since Jake arrived at Outpost Haven, the nearest human settlement willing to harbor him and his unusual passengers. Dr. Beth Hayes, the outpost chief biologist, had become fascinated with Spark and Jade from the moment she saw them. Today she sat in Jake's quarters with a puzzle box in her hands, watching Jade with wide eyes. The puzzle box was complex, designed to test cognitive abilities in various species. It required understanding spatial relationships, cause and effect, and sequential problem solving. Most animals couldn't solve it at all. Intelligent species took anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. Jade studied it for maybe 30 seconds, tilting her head. Then her claws moved with surprising precision, pressing panels in a specific sequence, sliding sections apart, rotating the core. 2 minutes later, the box clicked open, revealing the treat inside. Jake, Beth said slowly, her voice full of wonder. This isn't animal behavior. This is genuine problem-solving intelligence. Do you understand what this means? Tell that to the Quellans, Jake replied. He was sitting on the floor where both dragons were currently sprawled across him like oversized cats. They'd grown incredibly fast once he got proper nutrition into them. Each dragon was now the size of a large dog, their emerald scales gleaming with health, their wings developing strong muscle definition. Spark chirped and nudged Jake's hand with her snout, making a questioning sound. Over the past 3 weeks, Jake had learned to understand their vocalizations. Chirps meant questions or curiosity. Low thrums meant contentment and happiness. There was a specific trill that meant hungry again, which he heard a lot since they were growing so fast. A warble meant they wanted to play, and a soft coo meant they were ready for sleep. I know, Spark, Jake said, scratching under her chin the way she liked. But you just ate an hour ago. Spark made the trill sound. Definitely hungry again. Beth laughed, but her smile faded quickly. Jake, I need to tell you something. The Quellans aren't giving up. They've sent enforcers to the outpost. Official diplomatic mission, complete with immunity. They're demanding access to inspect for stolen property. Jake's hand stilled on Spark's scales. When? They dock tomorrow at dawn. Station command can't legally refuse them entry. Beth's expression was grim. They have all the right paperwork. Unless we can prove Spark and Jade are sapient beings and not property, there's nothing we can do. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, mind racing through every possible scenario. None of them ended well. The Quellans had power, resources, and the law on their side. He had 2 dragons and a stubborn refusal to give up. Jade and Spark sensed his anxiety. They always did. They climbed onto his bunk, something they'd started doing in the second week. Jade pressed against his left side, warm and solid. Spark curled against his right, her tail wrapping around his arm. They made soft, comforting sounds, trying to soothe him the way he'd soothed them during those first terrible days. I won't let them take you, Jake whispered into the darkness. I promise. Spark chirped softly. It sounded almost like she was saying, we know. Dawn came too quickly. Jake heard the docking clamps engage, the hiss of airlocks connecting. Heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. Then the pounding on his door. Captain Morrison, a harsh voice called. Open this door immediately. Quellan diplomatic enforcement. We have authorization to reclaim stolen Directorate property. Jake stood slowly. Spark and Jade were instantly on their feet, positioning themselves between Jake and the door. Their posture had changed completely. No longer playful or relaxed, they stood ready, protective, their eyes fixed on the door with clear understanding of the threat beyond it. It's okay, Jake told them quietly, though his heart was racing. Let me handle this. He opened the door. 3 Quellan enforcers stood there, tall and imposing in their dark uniforms. The leader, a grim-faced male with cold eyes, held a containment pole, the kind used for capturing dangerous animals. Captain Morrison, by order of the Quellan Science Directorate, we are here to reclaim research specimens designated Experiments 7A and 7B. Stand aside. They have names, Jake said evenly. Spark and Jade. The enforcer ignored him, stepping forward with the containment pole extended toward Spark. Compliance is not optional. Interfering with Directorate operations. He didn't finish the sentence. Spark moved faster than Jake had ever seen her move. She lunged forward, placing herself directly in the path of the containment pole, and opened her mouth. Fire erupted from her throat. It was the first time either dragon had breathed fire, and it was magnificent and terrifying all at once. The flames shot out in a concentrated stream, not wild but controlled, aimed precisely at the containment pole. The metal heated instantly, glowing red, and the enforcer yelped and dropped it. The pole clattered to the floor, still glowing. The enforcer stumbled backward, staring at his singed uniform where the heat had gotten too close. Behind him, the other 2 enforcers reached for their weapons. Jade roared. The sound was incredible, nothing like the soft chirps and trills Jake was used to. It was deep and primal, a sound that vibrated through the floor and rattled the walls. Flames danced around her teeth, flickering between her fangs as she stood beside her sister, wings spread in a clear threat display. The enforcers froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Jake spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Still think they're non-sapient? He asked. Because it looks to me like they understand exactly what's happening here. They know you're a threat. And they're choosing to protect themselves and me. The lead enforcer's face had gone pale. He looked at the glowing containment pole, at the 2 dragons standing ready, at Jake's calm expression. This isn't over, he finally said, backing toward the door. The Directorate will hear about this. Harboring dangerous creatures, assault on diplomatic personnel. Get out, Jake said simply. The enforcers retreated. But as the door closed behind them, Jake knew Beth had been right. This was far from over. The courtroom on Station Unity was the largest Jake had ever seen. It had to be to accommodate representatives from 40 different species, each with their own seating requirements, atmospheric needs, and translation equipment. The chamber was a massive dome with tiered seating that rose up on all sides, making Jake feel very small sitting at the defendant's table in the center. His career was over. He knew that. Captain Jake Morrison, formerly of the Survey Corps, now facing charges of theft, smuggling, and insubordination. His uniform had been taken away. He sat in plain civilian clothes, which somehow made everything feel more real, more final. But Spark and Jade sat beside him, and that made it worth it. Beth had worked for days designing translator collars for them, adapting human speech technology to work with dragon vocalizations. The collars rested around their necks, sleek and unobtrusive. Both dragons had grown even more in the past month. They were the size of ponies now, their scales brilliant green, their eyes bright and alert as they watched the proceedings. The Quellan prosecutor stood, his tall frame imposing as he addressed the court. His name was Velthor, and he was efficient, cold, and completely convinced of his rightness. The facts are simple, Velthor began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. The human, Captain Morrison, illegally removed Directorate property from a research facility on Talvex 7. The specimens? They have names, Jake interrupted, unable to stop himself. Every eye in the courtroom turned to him. Spark and Jade. They're not specimens. The judge, a human woman named Rachel Kim, gave him a warning look but didn't reprimand him. Velthor barely paused. The specimens, he continued, emphasizing the word, are genetically cataloged assets of Quellan research. They were created under Directorate jurisdiction, maintained at Directorate expense, and are registered as Directorate property under interstellar salvage and research laws. We demand their immediate return and full financial damages for their illegal removal and the disruption to our research program. Jake's attorney, a sharp-minded man named David Brooks who'd volunteered to take the case, stood up. He was younger than Jake expected, with kind eyes and a determined set to his jaw. Your Honor, David said clearly, the Quellans would have you believe this is a simple property dispute. It's not. Over the past 6 weeks, we have documented extensive evidence that Spark and Jade possess genuine sapient intelligence. Tool use, complex communication, emotional bonds, abstract problem-solving abilities that exceed many recognized sapient species. Many animals solve problems, Velthor shot back dismissively. Earth dogs can learn tricks, Avian species can use tools. This proves nothing about sapience. These are trained animals at best. David smiled slightly, like he'd been waiting for that exact response. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A. The courtroom's main screen flickered to life. The video showed Jade in Jake's quarters about 2 weeks ago. Beth had given her charcoal and paper, just to see what would happen. The courtroom watched in complete silence as Jade picked up the charcoal carefully in her claws. Her movements were deliberate, thoughtful. She studied the paper for a long moment, then began to draw. It was crude, the lines shaky and imprecise. But the image was unmistakable. 2 small dragon shapes drawn side by side. Next to them, a larger figure, clearly humanoid. And above them all, a symbol, a circle with radiating lines, that meant family, or home in ancient Earth languages. That symbol, David said quietly, exists in human cultures from thousands of years ago. Jade was never taught its meaning. She couldn't have been. Yet she drew it to represent her relationship with her sister and Captain Morrison. This isn't mimicry or training. This is abstract thinking. This is understanding emotional concepts and expressing them through art. The courtroom remained silent. Even Velthor seemed momentarily thrown. David continued, his voice growing stronger. The Quellans claim these dragons are genetically modified creations. Our analysis of the data from their own research station tells a different story. Spark and Jade are completely natural. They are the last survivors of a species native to the Talvex system. A species that the Quellans themselves hunted to extinction over the past 50 years because their scales had commercial value. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Several species representatives leaned forward with renewed interest. The Quellan researchers knew a catastrophic ice storm was approaching Talvex 7, David said, his voice hard now. They evacuated everything they deemed valuable. But these 2 baby dragons? They were left behind. Abandoned. The final log entry described them as non-essential, and said their retrieval wasn't cost-effective. He turned to face Velthor directly. They left 2 living, breathing creatures to freeze to death because saving them was inconvenient. Captain Morrison did what any decent being should do when faced with innocent lives in danger. He showed mercy. He showed compassion. He showed the basic decency that apparently the Quellan Directorate lacks. Objection. Velthor snapped. This is inflammatory. It's the truth, David said simply. He pulled up another image on the screen, the station logs showing the evacuation orders and that final damning note about cost-effectiveness. Then something happened that no one expected. Spark stood up on her hind legs, balancing carefully. The translator collar around her neck activated as she made a series of chirps and clicks. The mechanical voice that came from the collar was small and slightly distorted, but completely clear. We want, stay. Jake. The courtroom exploded into noise. Representatives from dozens of species talking at once, translators struggling to keep up. Judge Kim banged her gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in this court. Spark remained standing, her golden eyes fixed on the judge. She made another sound and the translator spoke again. Jake saved us. Jake, family. Jade stood beside her sister, both dragons looking small and vulnerable despite their size, and added her own voice through her translator. Not property. Not things. We, alive. Judge Kim stared at them for a long moment. The entire courtroom had gone absolutely silent again. Then she looked at Velthor, at David and finally at Jake. I've heard enough, she said quietly. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for my decision. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom cleared, Jake put a hand on each dragon's neck. They pressed against him, seeking comfort. Tomorrow would decide everything. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Jake barely slept, and from the way Spark and Jade stayed close to him, neither had they. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Rachel Kim entered and everyone stood. She took her seat, looked at the assembled representatives, and then directly at Spark and Jade. I have reviewed all evidence presented in this case, she began, her voice steady and clear. I have considered the legal arguments, the scientific data, and most importantly, the testimony from the defendants themselves. Jake held his breath. Provisional sapience status granted, Judge Kim announced. Spark and Jade are hereby recognized as sentient beings with full legal protections under interstellar law. Custody is awarded to Captain Jake Morrison, pending the dragon's own informed choice when they reach full maturity and can confirm this arrangement of their own free will. The courtroom erupted. Jake felt his knees go weak. Furthermore, the judge continued, raising her voice over the noise, The Quellan Directorate is fined 2 million credits and sanctioned for negligent endangerment of a sentient species, illegal abandonment and falsification of genetic research data. This decision is final. Velthor's face went through several shades of purple, but there was nothing he could do. The law had spoken. Spark and Jade pressed against Jake from both sides, thrumming so loudly he could feel the vibrations through his whole body. He wrapped his arms around them, not caring who saw the tears running down his face. The decision sent shockwaves across the galaxy. News networks from dozens of worlds covered the story. Some praised the ruling. Others called it absurd, dangerous even. But Jake didn't care about any of that. He had his dragons and they were safe. 6 months passed in a blur. The Quellans appealed the decision 3 times. All 3 appeals were denied. Finally they stopped trying, though Jake knew they'd never really forgive him for what they saw as theft. Earth was the only planet willing to grant Spark and Jade permanent sanctuary. Other worlds were too worried about setting precedents, about upsetting the Quellans, about harboring creatures they didn't understand. But Earth's government, with its long history of wildlife conservation and protection programs, welcomed them. Jake chose Montana for their new home. Wide open spaces, mountains that stretched toward the sky, clean air, and most importantly, privacy. He bought a piece of land in the middle of nowhere, where his closest neighbor was 15 miles away. The day they arrived, Jake just stood there for a moment taking it all in. The mountains rose up like ancient guardians, their peaks still dusted with snow even in summer. The sky was impossibly blue, stretching forever in all directions. A river ran through the property, clear and cold from mountain runoff. Spark and Jade had grown to the size of horses now. Their scales gleamed like living emeralds in the Montana sun, each one perfect and brilliant. Their wings had developed fully, strong and capable, though they'd never had the space to really fly before. "Go ahead," Jake told them, gesturing at the open sky. "It's all yours." They looked at each other, then at him as if asking permission. When he nodded again, they launched themselves into the air. Jake watched them soar, swooping and diving, testing their wings in ways they'd never been able to before. They climbed higher and higher, dancing through the clouds, their joyful roars echoing off the mountains. They did loops and barrel rolls, playing tag in the sky like the children they still were. Jake had to wipe his eyes. Again. He seemed to be doing that a lot lately. "You know other species are calling you crazy," a familiar voice said behind him. Jake turned to find Beth, who'd taken a leave from the outpost to help him set up the new facility. She smiled at him, shading her eyes as she watched the dragons play. "Taking in refugees no one else wants," she continued. "They say you're building some kind of sanctuary for the galaxy's rejects. Let them talk." Jake watched Spark and Jade soar overhead, their scales flashing in the sunlight. Besides, they're not wrong. 3 more ships had already contacted Earth in the past month. A Cormac cub whose parents had died in a mining accident, rejected by their clan for being too small. A Silurian who'd been born mute, unable to speak their species' complex language, and therefore considered worthless by their society. A Vexian with a genetic condition that made their shell grow differently, scheduled for euthanization as defective. Jake had said yes to all of them. He was already planning expansions to the property, different habitats for different needs. Beth was helping him design environmental systems. Other humans had started volunteering, wanting to be part of something that mattered. Word was spreading across the galaxy. There was a planet where a human had chosen compassion over convenience, where beings deemed worthless by their own kind could find safety, where life was valued simply for being life. That night, Jake sat outside under the stars. Spark and Jade, exhausted from their first real day of flying, curled around him like they had since that first frozen day on Talvex 7. They were massive now, warm and solid and alive, their gentle thrumming filling the air with contentment. "We're going to need a bigger house," Jake murmured, scratching under Jade's chin. "And probably a bigger property. Maybe the whole valley." Jade rumbled her agreement, her tail thumping happily against the ground. Spark shifted closer, resting her enormous head on Jake's lap. Above them, the stars shone cold and distant. Out there, the galaxy operated on logic, on cost-benefit analysis, on measuring worth by usefulness. Species rose and fell based on their strength, their intelligence, their ability to contribute. But here, on this small planet in an unremarkable solar system, humanity offered something different. Something revolutionary. Love for those who couldn't earn it. Protection for those who couldn't fight for themselves. A home for those the cosmos had discarded. And 2 dragons, once left to freeze to death because saving them wasn't cost-effective, had become ambassadors of a truth the galaxy had forgotten. Some things were worth saving simply because they deserved to live. Jake looked up at the stars and smiled. Let the galaxy think him crazy. He had work to do.